My ex invited me to his wedding to show off his wealthy fiancée, but my unexpected plus one turned the tables spectacularly. I'm 22, and a few years ago, I met Ethan, a 30-year-old man, while we were both working part-time at a local coffee shop in Seattle. Ethan was juggling this job alongside paying off his student loans, while I was still in college and trying to save enough money to move out of my parents' house for good. My parents had always struggled with compulsive spending, so I grew up dealing with financial instability. Ethan's situation wasn't much better. His parents had racked up significant debt of their own, leaving him to fend for himself financially. Ethan and I initially bonded over stories about our families, but over time, we realized we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. 2 years later, I graduated and had saved enough to move into my own apartment. Ethan, however, was still living at his parents' house, buried under his student debt. I invited him to move in with me since it was clear his situation wasn't improving, and though he agreed, he can only contribute 20% of the rent. I covered the remaining 80%. We split the utilities evenly, but the financial imbalance was clear. Our jobs were quite different. I landed a corporate job with flexible hours, allowing me to work from home occasionally, while Ethan worked a physically demanding job that required long hours on site. Because of his schedule, he rarely had the energy to help around the house. I took it upon myself to handle most of the cleaning, cooking, laundry, and dishes, understanding how exhausting his job was. I didn't mind this arrangement for the most part, though I did ask him to take out the trash occasionally since it was something small he could do. Unfortunately, Ethan rarely remembered to take out the trash. Every morning, as I left for work, the garbage would still be sitting there. One weekend, after a particularly rough week, I returned home to a house in complete disarray, empty food containers and wrappers everywhere, dishes piled up in the sink, and the trash overflowing. I was exhausted and just wanted to relax, but the mess was unbearable. I spent the entire evening cleaning, hoping Ethan would notice the effort I'd put in. When Ethan finally got home, he greeted me warmly, saying he'd missed me, but didn't acknowledge the cleaned house. Instead, he plopped down on the couch to watch a game. I felt completely invisible. Tears welled up in my eyes for the first time as I realized just how unappreciated I was. Ethan noticed something was off and asked if I was okay. I shook my head and said I was just tired, then reminded him to take out the trash before heading upstairs. The next morning, the trash was still there. When Ethan walked into the kitchen and asked me what was for breakfast, I lost it. I told him he could make his own food if he was hungry. He looked at me, taken aback, and accused me of being rude. That was the breaking point. I yelled at him, calling him out for doing nothing around the house. His response? He rolled his eyes and told me I was being overdramatic. After taking a deep breath, I asked him why he never remembered to take out the trash. His response was a dismissive "I forgot." That was it. I unleashed everything I'd been holding back, asking him what he actually contributed to our household besides sitting on the couch and drinking beer. He argued that he deserved to relax after work because his job was so physically draining. I asked him, "And what about me?" I reminded him that I worked full-time, cooked for both of us, cleaned the entire house, did the laundry, and even ironed his shirts every week. His reply? "I never asked you to do any of that." Ethan went on to say that his job was harder than mine and that as his girlfriend, I should support him the way his mom supported his dad. Hearing that infuriated me. I wasn't his mother, and I certainly wasn't going to let him take advantage of me anymore. I told him things were about to change. From now on, he would cook his own meals, do his own laundry, iron his own shirts, and clean up after himself. And he would take out the trash. When I also told him he'd need to start paying half the rent or find another place to live, Ethan looked stunned. He demanded to know where this was coming from, but I made it clear I was done doing all the work in our relationship. I left for work before he could argue further, and for the first time in my life, I felt empowered. True to my word, I stopped cleaning up after him. I only cooked for myself and started eating out of takeout containers to avoid adding to the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. Ethan refused to take the trash out, thinking I'd eventually cave, but I didn't. The smell grew unbearable, and the dishes piled up, but I stood my ground. He tried to guilt-trip me, telling me I wasn't being a good partner, but I ignored him. When it came time to pay rent, I paid my 50% directly to the landlord and told her Ethan would cover the rest. He was furious when he found out and tried to convince me to continue paying 80%, but I firmly refused. For the first time, he was forced to take responsibility. Ethan never once expressed regret during this entire ordeal. Not once did he acknowledge his mistakes or apologize for taking me for granted. In hindsight, I wish I had realized sooner who he truly was. Over the next few months, our arguments grew increasingly heated. Ethan often accused me of being the one at fault and tried to manipulate me into reverting to my old habits of taking care of him. For Ethan, the tipping point seemed to be my promotion at work. He must have heard about it from one of our mutual friends, Jenna, who also happened to be my co-worker. That night, Ethan came home drunk and woke me up, saying he needed to talk. Groggy and irritated, I asked him if it could wait until morning, but he insisted it was important. Reluctantly, I sat up and asked what was so urgent. That's when Ethan, clearly inebriated, admitted he'd met someone at work. I immediately knew he was talking about Tessa. I'd seen her at one of Ethan's office parties, a 25-year-old woman from an affluent family. Her father owned a chain of manufacturing companies, and the only reason Tessa had a job was because her father wanted her to gain work experience. Ethan went on to tell me that he was falling for Tessa, claiming she was a real woman compared to me. I felt nothing. By then, we were more like roommates than a couple, and our relationship had been crumbling for months. I listened in silence as he continued to ramble about Tessa. Finally, I cut him off mid-sentence and told him I didn't care. In fact, I was happy for him. I suggested we end things amicably and asked him to move out as soon as possible. Ethan looked stunned. "Are you jealous of Tessa?" he asked, almost smugly. I shook my head and smiled. "Not at all," I said. "I'm genuinely relieved you found someone else. It makes ending this relationship easier for both of us." That seemed to ignite something in him. His face turned red with anger, and he accused me of letting my promotion get to my head. Staying calm, I told him my decision had nothing to do with my career. I explained that I had realized over the past few months that we were no longer compatible. I even acknowledged that I understood why he might want to see someone else, given how disconnected we'd become. But instead of agreeing, Ethan began yelling. He ranted about how he hated modern women who flaunt their careers and insisted Tessa was a better woman because all she wanted was to settle down and start a family. I stayed composed and told him that every woman has different priorities. I loved my career, and Tessa might not care about hers because she came from wealth. If Ethan wanted someone like Tessa, I encouraged him to pursue her, but I reiterated that our relationship was over. He then asked how I planned to afford the rent without him. Smiling, I explained that my recent raise meant I could now cover the full rent on my own. Hearing this only made him angrier. He accused me of trying to show off and claimed Tessa was far wealthier than I'd ever be since her father had bought her a house. Then he scoffed, saying men ultimately want housewives, not women who earn more than they do. By this point, I was too tired to keep arguing. I told him he could sleep on the couch until the end of the month but would need to move out after that. He continued grumbling under his breath, but I ignored him and went back to sleep. Over the next week, Ethan started packing his things and moving them out little by little. Each time I saw him leave with another box, I felt a growing sense of relief. The thought of having the entire apartment to myself was exhilarating. But then, last night, something unexpected happened. When I got home from work, I found Ethan and Tessa sitting on my couch. I gave him a questioning look, and he casually explained that he wanted to show Tessa his apartment since it was his last night living there. I couldn't believe the audacity of bringing her into my home without asking. Still, I didn't want to make a scene. I greeted Tessa politely, but she barely acknowledged me, glancing at me with thinly veiled disdain. Choosing not to take it personally, I went to freshen up. Later, while I was in the kitchen making myself some spaghetti, Tessa walked in to get a glass of water. She stood there for a moment, watching me with the same condescending expression as before. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, I asked if she needed anything. She shook her head and walked off without a word. I finished my meal and retreated to my room, hoping to avoid more awkward interactions. However, as I was heading downstairs to put my plate in the sink, I overheard Ethan and Tessa talking. Tessa's voice drifted through the living room as she told Ethan how lucky he was to have upgraded. Ethan laughed and agreed, which stopped me in my tracks. Then Tessa asked him why he'd ever been with someone like me. Ethan's response shattered my heart. He admitted that he'd only dated me because I was naive enough to lend him money during college and cover most of our expenses. He laughed as he confessed he'd been able to save a significant amount of money because I'd been paying over half the rent for the past 2 years. I stood frozen in disbelief. While I'd suspected Ethan had taken advantage of my kindness to some extent, I hadn't realized he'd been using me from the very beginning. Tessa and Ethan continued to mock me, dissecting our relationship and belittling me in every way imaginable. Embarrassed and on the verge of tears, I refused to let them see me break down. Quietly, I slipped upstairs, buried my face in my pillow, and cried for the rest of the night. The next morning, Ethan and Tessa were gone. Ethan had finally moved out, taking the last of his things. For the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. As I wandered around the house, I realized he was truly out of my life. The relief was indescribable. I cried happy tears and even danced around the living room. Determined to wipe away every trace of him, I spent the rest of the day cleaning the house. For the first time in years, I appreciated my independence. In the weeks that followed, I gradually stopped caring about the cruel things Ethan and Tessa had said about me. My life began to feel lighter, happier. Everything was going well until 2 months later, when a mutual friend at work told me that Ethan and Tessa were engaged. The news caught me off guard, and I was even more surprised when my friend showed me their engagement photos. They looked like a happy couple, though their whirlwind engagement seemed rushed. I admitted to myself that I'd never have been truly happy with Ethan, and I was glad he'd found someone who suited him better. Still, a pang of regret lingered, knowing how he'd exploited me for years. Despite everything, I wished them well. That evening, when I returned home and checked my mailbox, I found an unexpected wedding invitation. My eyes widened when I saw it was from Ethan and Tessa. I opened it cautiously, unsure what to expect. Scribbled in the corner of the card was a message that made my jaw drop. "I want you to attend my wedding so you can see the grand life I'm going to have with Tessa." I stared at the words in disbelief. It became clear that Ethan had invited me purely to flaunt his success, his marriage to a wealthy woman, and his newfound fortune. The years of suppressed resentment and anger bubbled to the surface. If Ethan wanted to be petty, I decided I could be petty too. A scheme began forming in my mind, and I replied yes to the RSVP with a +1. That night, I opened my laptop and scoured Tessa's social media. I clicked through every photo she'd ever posted, searching for something specific. After some digging, I found it, her ex-boyfriend, Jake. Based on her posts, it was clear they had been together for years. The photos went all the way back to high school. Their relationship had ended just 6 months before her engagement to Ethan. I sent Jake a friend request, and to my surprise, he accepted within a few hours. I sent him a message, explaining who I was and why I was reaching out. Jake responded, curious and eager to hear more. Over the next few days, we struck up a genuine conversation. I told him about my relationship with Ethan and my plans to attend the wedding as his +1. Jake was intrigued and wanted to know more. As we continued talking, Jake opened up about his history with Tessa. He revealed that their relationship had ended after years of infidelity on her part. It turned out Tessa had cheated on Jake with Ethan, which explained how their relationship began. Jake wasn't shocked by her betrayal. He said Tessa had always been drawn to older men. Even after their messy breakup, Tessa had asked Jake to stay friends, but he'd blocked her on every platform. I shared my own story with Jake, detailing how Ethan had used me and how he and Tessa had ridiculed me. Jake was appalled when he learned how Ethan had treated me. After hearing everything, he agreed to be my date for the wedding. The wedding day finally arrived. As I walked into the venue with Jake, I spotted Ethan immediately. His face froze in shock the moment he saw us together. He must have recognized Jake instantly. Ethan's eyes darted between us, his expression a mix of panic and fury. Jake and I ignored him, calmly finding our assigned seats. Moments later, Ethan approached me, hissing under his breath, "Why are you here with Tessa's ex?" I smiled sweetly and replied, "You invited me, remember? Plus, it's a wedding, I needed a date." Ethan glared at me but couldn't make a scene in front of the other guests. He stalked back up the aisle, shooting me one last livid look. Soon, the ceremony began. The music played, and Tessa walked in on her father's arm, looking radiant in a white, floor-length gown. After the ceremony, the reception moved to a lavishly decorated ballroom. Tessa had changed into a sleek evening dress by the time she spotted us. Her steps faltered when her eyes landed on Jake. For a moment, she looked utterly baffled. Then she glanced at me and back at him. "What are you doing here, with her?" she asked Jake, her voice laced with disbelief. Grinning, I answered before Jake could. "Oh, I invited him. Isn't that what people do at weddings? Bring someone special?" Tessa turned to Jake, clearly flustered, and demanded to know if we were dating. Her cheeks flushed with rage, but Jake said nothing. An absurd question like that didn't deserve a response. Tessa shot me a sour look before nodding stiffly. Then Jake asked if they could speak privately, saying he didn't want her to make a scene. She agreed, and the two of them left the room. As they walked away, I caught Ethan staring at me from across the reception hall, his expression tense and hawkish. He looked anxious, as though he wanted to intervene, but he couldn't do anything without causing a commotion. All he could do was sit there, pretending nothing was wrong. The celebration continued, with guests enjoying the music and food, but as an hour passed, whispers began to circulate. Where was the bride? Tessa was nowhere to be seen, and the growing concern was palpable. Her father, clearly worried, sent a bridesmaid upstairs to check on her. A few minutes later, the bridesmaid returned, holding a note. In front of the entire room, she hesitated before reading it aloud. Tessa's letter was brief but devastating. She admitted she had made a terrible mistake marrying Ethan. She explained that seeing Jake again had rekindled feelings she thought she'd buried, and she couldn't go through with the marriage. The room fell silent as everyone processed what they'd just heard. Ethan looked utterly humiliated, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. The guests, stunned by the revelation, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even I was in shock. I'd brought Jake to the wedding to annoy Ethan, but I never imagined things would unfold like this. As murmurs turned to quiet gasps, Ethan stood frozen, his face a mix of rage and despair. He looked like he was ready to explode but had no outlet for his anger. Tessa's parents, mortified, began apologizing profusely to the guests, urging everyone to leave. I watched Ethan, who had always been so arrogant and smug, crumble before my eyes. The day he had planned to flaunt his success had become the stage for his downfall. Despite feeling a bit bad about how the wedding ended, I couldn't help but feel relieved. His attempt to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. After the wedding, I started receiving mixed reactions from friends. Some thought I'd gone too far by bringing Jake as my guest, while others felt I'd done the right thing. To be clear, I never intended to ruin Ethan's wedding. I hadn't even told Jake to confront Tessa. I had no idea what private conversations they'd had that led to her calling off the marriage. Still, Ethan's invitation had been a clear attempt to rub his perfect life in my face. I simply responded in kind. A couple of days later, Jake texted me with a long message. He thanked me for inviting him to the wedding and shared more details about what had happened. Apparently, Tessa had consulted her parents after deciding to leave Ethan, and they were relieved she hadn't gone through with the wedding. Jake told me he'd explain everything in person soon. Ethan, on the other hand, had been bombarding me with hostile texts and calls, blaming me for ruining his life. I ignored every message, knowing I had no obligation to engage with him. His marriage falling apart wasn't my fault, it was Tessa's decision. Today, Ethan showed up at my house, knowing I'd be home on the weekend. At first, I refused to open the door, but he insisted he wouldn't leave until we talked. Eventually, I cracked the door open and told him he could say whatever he wanted from outside. I wasn't letting him in. He immediately started yelling, accusing me of sabotaging his life. Apparently, he had quit his job, assuming that marrying Tessa would mean he'd never have to work again. "You brought Jake to the wedding on purpose," he shouted. At that, I snapped. "Yes, I did. And I overheard everything you said to Tessa about me that night," I said coldly. Ethan's eyes widened. He had no response as I continued, "You used me to pay for your dates and your rent all those years. I might have been naive, but I loved you, and I did those things because I cared about you. But you never respected me. You even cheated on me with Tessa." I reminded him that I'd never interfered in his relationship with Tessa, even after their affair. What pushed me over the edge was his decision to invite me to the wedding just to flaunt his success. "You had no right to come here and blame me for something that isn't my fault," I said firmly. "Tessa made her own decisions. If you're angry, take it up with her, not me." But Ethan wasn't done. He started shouting that I shouldn't punish him for the past, saying it wasn't his fault I'd been too innocent to realize he'd been using me. He ranted about how Tessa was supposed to change his life and give him everything he'd ever wanted. I couldn't help but laugh at his delusions. "You ruined your own chance by being selfish and manipulative," I told him. Ethan glared at me, ranting about how I destroyed his opportunity to woo Tessa. At that point, I'd had enough. His words were vile, and I refused to listen to him any longer. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police," I said firmly. Ethan refused to leave my property, taunting me by saying I'd never dare to call the police. Undeterred, I pulled out my phone and dialed right in front of him. The moment he realized I was serious, his smug expression faltered. He backtracked quickly, muttering something about me overreacting, and retreated down the steps. As he walked away, I vowed this would be the last time I ever saw him. After shutting the door, I told my family about the incident and immediately blocked Ethan on every platform. I also documented everything he'd done and decided to file a formal complaint with the authorities in case he tried to harass me again. To ensure my safety, I plan to install a camera by the door and change the locks on my house. Update 3. It's been about a month since everything happened. I've been incredibly busy at work, so I haven't had time to respond to the many messages asking whether Jake and I had stayed in touch. But I'm happy to share that we did meet up last week. Jake reached out and invited me to lunch to discuss everything. When I arrived at the restaurant, I was surprised to see Tessa sitting with him. My guard immediately went up. I thought she'd come to confront me. But when Tessa noticed me, she gave me a warm smile and greeted me kindly. Jake assured me she was there to apologize, though I was still wary. Tessa nodded and began by sincerely apologizing for the hurtful things she'd said about me in the past. She then opened up about her story with Ethan. She explained that Ethan had started paying her a lot of attention at work, especially during a rough patch in her relationship with Jake. Their demanding schedules meant they spent significant time together, and Ethan frequently complained about me and our relationship. Tessa admitted that his words painted me in a negative light and made her feel sorry for him. She began to believe his narrative of being a man stuck with an unappreciative partner. Ethan complimented her often, which she said made her feel gratified and flattered. Eventually, she got swept up in the attention and ended up having an affair with him. Feeling guilty about cheating on Jake, she convinced herself she could build a future with Ethan despite their differences. Tessa confessed that seeing me at the wedding made her feel insecure. She envied my independence and the fact that I didn't need a partner to look after me. She admitted that this was something she deeply admired about me and apologized again for the way she had treated me. I accepted her apology and shared how hard I'd worked to achieve my independence. Tessa listened quietly, her eyes cast down as she nodded. When I asked her what had happened at the wedding, she didn't hold back. She told me she was completely unprepared to see Jake there. The moment she saw his face, she realized how much she still loved him. The conversation they had in private only confirmed their feelings for one another. They decided to leave together that night, with Tessa leaving a note for her family to explain her decision. Jake added that since the wedding, he and Tessa had rekindled their relationship and were happier than ever. Tessa said her parents were initially furious about the situation, but after some time, they chose to support her decision. She also revealed that she was planning to file for an annulment from Ethan soon. Although the entire situation was uncomfortable to hear, I was relieved that at least someone had found happiness after all the chaos. Watching Jake and Tessa beam at one another as they told their story, I could tell they were genuinely in love. After lunch, we said our goodbyes and parted ways. I haven't spoken to either of them much since, and I intend to keep my distance. I don't want to get involved in their drama any further. Looking forward, I'm focusing on myself and my career. I've worked too hard to let anyone or anything distract me from my goals. As for Ethan, I don't know what his future holds. I can only hope he eventually learns from his mistakes and stops pursuing relationships for financial gain. Thank you for following my story. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more unbelievable real-life stories happening around you.